So let's talk about our infiltrators and intercessors and differentiate them from our inceptors and incursors. Time for a review of our Primaris infantry in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where today we're returning to focus on the Space Marines. I thought we'd take a look at the Primaris infantry in particular, talk through all their options, their strengths and weaknesses, and how I'd rank them against each other, roughly speaking. Games Workshop really have been fleshing out their new Space Marine range quite a bit over the last year or so. We've now got no less than 14 generic Primaris infantry units to choose from, and I thought it might be fun to put them up against each other and talk through my feelings on which are strongest and why. In any case, in today's video we're just going to be focusing on the generic Primaris infantry squads that can be taken by all chapters. I'm afraid we're not doing special characters today, not doing unique chapter choices such as Black Templar Sword Brethren or Deathwatch kill teams, and we're going to leave out any bikes and vehicles as well. I fully admit that lists like this are really quite arbitrary. It's kind of hard to give units individual placings. In general, I think maybe a tier ranking system is a little bit more representative of how the units actually rank up, as opposed to giving each one a placing in order. So I feel I could certainly be persuaded to swap a lot of these up or down a few placings. It kind of depends on what you value. Often we're comparing units with very different roles here, say ones that capture objectives to ones that deal damage. And even after that, a lot of these will be warped by what chapter you play. Certain units are just going to be massively stronger in certain chapters than others, say for example Salamander's Flamestorm Aggressors are quite a decent choice, but perhaps not quite so much with chapters that don't have that kind of raw strength on their flame weapons. With that in mind though, we'll go through each unit choice one by one. I'll talk through the rough strengths and weaknesses of the unit as to why I've ranked them where I have, and maybe focus on a few good chapters that really excel with the unit, maybe more than the placing would suggest. As always, look forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions down in the comments, and if you'd like to see more like this, certainly feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. In any case, on with the list. We'll start at the bottom and work our way up to the top. So first up we have the unit that I've chosen to rank in last place. I'm not sure to be the biggest surprise to some people, but it is Primaris Reavers here, the unit that's basically always struggled for a battlefield role within Codex Space Marines, having the unfortunate combination of being an elite's choice unit that really have very poor damage output, aren't particularly mobile when they're on the board, don't get OBSEC, and just really struggle not to be eclipsed on multiple different levels by a lot of different units. All that being said, they do have a fair few utility options that could have some theoretical use. They're a fairly cheap unit that could deep strike, though admittedly you could do that quite similarly with Vanguard veterans. Otherwise, at only 18 points per model, they're one of the more durable Primaris units, though I think in general their real selling point is their utility abilities. They give some leadership -2, which could occasionally cause some morale casualties, shock grenades to make enemy units not able to overwatch, and maybe give out a cheeky -1 to hit debuff, and perhaps most importantly of all, the Terror Troop stratagem cancelling OBSEC. That's really nice in combination with a Space Marine hero with Rights of War to give them OBSEC, giving you a good chance of swiping objectives. I feel like with a unit with a lot of thought could be made to work okay, but I'm just not personally convinced that the utility options really make up for their underwhelming damage, and also not filling one of those all-important troop slots. I think they're arguably better in most of the assault-related chapters, things like Blood Angels, Space Wolves, that sort of thing. Maybe particularly Blood Angels, as they have a bit of a better chance of making charges after they deep strike, which they kind of need to do to get that Terror Troops aura in range. Next up on the list we have Veteran Intercessors. I've ranked them 12th. They do have a lot of similarities with the Reavers in being a Space Marine Elite's choice that doesn't really do a lot more damage compared with the troops. They're basically standard intercessors that get an extra attack for 2 or 3 more points, which to be honest isn't the worst trade-off if you think you're primarily going to be using them in melee. And you can deck out the sergeants with some fancy gear as well, and they hit very hard and deep for the cost, having a massive 5 attacks on the charge. If you want to concentrate force of regular intercessors in impulsors, they could potentially be a decent option for that as well. I think their main downside is the combination of competing with the troops due to having no OBSEC and not filling those troop slots, while also struggling to compete with the elites as well. They're generally only going to be that efficient against light infantry, things that troops can often handle quite well. Often if you're actually looking for damage dealers, you want to be picking something that's going to have some general purpose things and can weigh in against some heavies as well. Still though, could be interesting enough if you just want some intercessors, no OBSEC but more fighting. Perhaps could be interesting in armies like White Scars, where they can advance and charge, and maybe even get damage to attacks when they get into their super doctrine. Next on the list we have Hellblasters. I've ranked them 11th. Kind of a niche fire support unit, although really quite a cool one with their awesome plasma weapons. The plasma incinerators will cut through most targets, they've got great AP and damage 2 or more if you overcharge, and in particular the assault plasma incinerator can be quite an interesting general purpose threat. Being a combination of damage 1 with decent strength and AP, it does mean it's really good against certain targets, for example Death Guard Plague Marines. Quite nice to have a weapon that's still efficient even if you've got a damage -1 rule going off. Their main disadvantage is just the sheer amount of ranged Space Marine firepower units you've got. They are really quite fragile for the cost, being the same as basic intercessors, somewhat short range if you actually want to be doing decent damage. Damage -1 can bite you if you really do want to be overcharging them, and if you are overcharging, you've always got the chance of killing your own models, meaning that you're kind of locking yourself into getting a captain to buff them as well. They really do want that support for reroll 1s if they're going to overcharge. Certainly very solid against elite infantry, but just a bit harder to use and less flexible than most, means that they're kind of rarely taken in strong lists. Perhaps standout chapters include Dark Angels, whose Weapon of the Dark Age stratagem can really make them very bitey. You can kick out an awful lot of high strength damage 3 attacks with these, making them a lot more viable. White Scar's Assault Incinerators are very nice, decent mobility there, plus just about any chapter with easy access to reroll 1s can be nice. Ultramarines can achieve that with a stratagem if they want, allowing them to operate a bit more independently. Next up we have the Aggressors. I've chosen to rank them 10th. Aggressors really went from a unit in the previous codex that was kind of spectacular in their just mass fire damage output to one that's kind of a bit tame now. They seem like a fairly reasonable unit in the Space Marine battle line. They've got a fair amount of anti-infantry ranged fire, backed up with some general purpose power fist attacks. If you can deliver them in close, they will do a pretty reasonable damage between their range and melee, though I think you do really want to be making use of both. I think their main issue is their delivery. They are kind of fragile for a very slow unit that needs to get close to be maximally effective, meaning that they're just not as often taken on the Space Marine battle line compared with their various elite damage dealer competitors, Blade Guard veterans, Vanguard veterans, other units that shoot well like Eradicators, or even things like Terminators that tend to be used a bit more often. They're usually a bit tankier for the point and can deep strike if needed. Still though, I think some chapters make particularly good use of them. Salamanders with Flamers are absolutely excellent. +1 to wound and getting max shot with those Flamers means that they can be a truly scary range damage output unit. And I think they're particularly interesting with Raven Guard as well. Being able to deep strike them for 1 CP is really interesting. Plus also I think they're a great unit to make use of their Warlord trait, where you can just scoot them up to the very front of your army and hopefully have a big turn of damage dealing, clearing out infantry and heavies. In 9th place we've got the Heavy Intercessors. They're very tough Gravis armoured troops, perhaps their main role just being sitting around on home field objectives, being hard to shift with their toughness 5, and being able to lay down some nice general purpose firepower with their long range and strength 5. They basically feel like the premium choice if you want to really lock down a home field objective, but the main issue that sees them not taking quite as much I think is the fact that a minimum size squad of them costs 140 points, and it just feels like a bit of an overinvestment when a lot of the time a regular intercessor squad is going to do the job just as well and cost 40 points less. They're generally a bit tankier than regular intercessors, but their damage output per point tends to be a bit lower, and they're also quite a bit less flexible. They're not as good in melee per point, and you don't have any options for giving fancy melee kits to the squad sergeant. I think maybe interesting chapters are Imperial Fists. They really quite like nice generalist strength 5 bolters, and options to make them even tougher are quite nice. Iron Hands for their Feel No Pain really gives you a squad that's going to be very hard to shift at range, and I think Salamanders can make quite good use of them as well. Their rerolls work quite well with that damage 3 heavy bolter that they can field. Ignoring AP -1 is nice, and it works quite well with a Salamander's very Gravis heavy force, perhaps helping to overload the enemy with toughness 5 targets. Still though, for the most part, for capturing home field objectives, it seems that people prefer some of the other troops. In 8th place I've chosen to rank the Inceptors, the jump pack Gravis boys that can either pack Plasma Exterminators or Assault Bolters. A fairly easy to use unit with some mid-range firepower and good mobility. I think there's advantages to both the bolters and the plasmas. The bolters do fairly decent damage against any medium or light infantry. I mean that the unit's really quite cheap for jumping around the place and throwing onto objectives and things. The plasmas really are quite lethal against just about everything, particularly elite infantry with 6 or more models in the squad. Still though, as a unit as a whole, I don't think that they're the most efficient. If you take the plasmas, then the models are just incredibly expensive. 60 points really is quite pricey for a model that's only got the toughness of any other Gravis Marine, and of course you do have the option of just blowing yourself up with your own plasma if you happen to get unlucky. The bolter loadout is a fair bit tougher for the cost, but still not standout so, and while the damage output isn't too bad if you can get multiple rounds of shooting, It's just not all that exciting within the Space Marine Codex. Still though, I think a fair amount of chapters can make very good use of them. Imperial Fists in particular get on great with the Assault Bolters, really quite a nice unit for being aggressive and jumping towards the enemy. White Scars Advance and Shoot can be really nice with the Plasma, starting them on the board and hopefully getting a turn 1 Alpha Strike on the go. Ultramarine Seal of Oath works really well with those Plasmas as well. 4 rerolls is exactly what you want on such a general purpose deletion unit. And again, Dark Angel's Weapons of the Dark Age is always going to be worth mentioning when we have plasma weapons concerned. If you can target elite infantry with 6 or more models in, then a unit of 6 of these puts out a casual 36 shots at strength 8 damage 3, likely just burying whatever they were targeting. Next up we have Suppressors, who have ranked 7th. They're fairly fragile, long-range auto-cannon guys with jump packs, who kind of can't decide whether they want to be Devastators or Assault Marines. I do feel that their actual stat line is a little bit on the underwhelming side. They're fairly fragile for the points cost. They might easily take the penalty for moving and shooting with heavy weapons, and their weapons can be subject to damage -1 effects, which isn't all that helpful. Still though, these do seem to see a surprising amount of play in tournament lists, just basically because they're a unit that can both put out some reliable long-range firepower while staying safe, and also as and when they're needed, they can be jumping into table quarters to take them for engage on all fronts with 3 models, or potentially being fairly handy for doing certain actions. In Warzone Nachmans though, maybe that might see a little bit less play. They're no longer a good choice for retrieved Nachman data, for example, which might well lead to them being played less. I'd say perhaps the 2 best chapters for them are the ones that allow them to move and shoot in their doctrines, Iron Hand's Devastator one, which also gives you some reroll ones to hit, or Ultramarines in their tactical one. Moving up, I feel we're getting into the most competitive tier of Primaris Infantry now, and in 6th place I've chosen to rank the Assault Intercessors. 19 points per model and equipped with AP-1 chainswords, are cheap, tough, objective-secured troops, and really can be quite focused on what they're doing and moving towards objectives, as they don't have firepower to distract them from going onto them. They should make a real mess of enemy light infantry that they catch, can still threaten heavy infantry, and give you the option of a fairly powerful fights twice stratagem for 2 CP if it is going to make a big difference to what they can do. Perhaps the main weaknesses are being relatively slow moving. They're not often going to get the best choice of what targets they can charge, and if they're forced to charge heavies then that's not going to be quite as good. And you would probably want to weigh them up against things like Vanguard Veterans or Blade Guard for going forward into the midfield. They feel like a unit that might want to follow on in the second wave as opposed to being the main spearhead. Still though, for taking objectives and skirmishing with enemy infantry, I think they're really quite efficient. Naturally they're going to be better with most melee chapters, maybe White Scars in particular, with being able to advance and charge and damage 2 weapons in the Assault Doctrine, but basically anything else melee focused is great as well. Blood Angels with +1 to wound is great on low strength weapons. Space Wolves can layer all sorts of melee buffs, as can Black Templars. I think that Assault Intercessors are really quite an interesting choice compared with Crusader squads, swapping out those cheap and effective neophytes for the ability to take some other interesting power weapons and potentially fight twice for 2 CP. Next up, in 5th place we have Eliminators, a unit that I really like. 75 points for a cheap and effective squad of snipers. They can forward deploy to put a really irritating threat on a midfield objective, maybe be in the right place for doing certain secondaries, and if you put them in cover, they're decently tough for the points as well. Their camo cloaks giving you +1 to the save means that your opponent's usually going to have to fire something fairly high AP against them to shift them from cover. On top of that, as far as sniper weapons go, they are one of the stronger choices in the entire game of 40k. Snipers do have their disadvantages, with needing line of sight and bodyguard rules being fairly rampant, but if they do manage to deliver a kill on a key buffing character, that could be a really big deal. They've also got a few tricks with certain sniper rounds. They can use their Instigator Bolt Carbine to give them a bit of jump shoot jump, which is really nice for the extra movement, and just in general they can be quite nice chaff to put in the midfield, knowing that if you happen to lose them, you've only lost a 75 points investment, and hopefully you've forced the opponent to reveal themselves, ready for your counter-attack. On the downsides, I do feel that their las fusils are really quite underwhelming still. They could do with a bit of a buff to compete with the bolt snipers, and they will die fairly easily to melee. They don't get their camo cloaks saved there, and they won't be quite as tough as, say, a unit of incursors. For good chapters, I think it almost goes without saying that they're pretty decent in Raven Guard. +1 to hit and wound when sniping characters is a really nice bonus. It means they can even move and shoot against them and still be hitting on 2s. Imperial Fists get to ignore cover and get extra hits on 6s, really nice for powerful bolt weapons. And I think that Iron Hands are worth a good shout as well. Turn 1 being able to move and shoot for no penalty, also reroll 1s, and getting a 6+ feel no pain are all great things for a far-flung unit like this. In fourth place, I've chosen to rank Blade Guard Veterans. A really fun unit to use, very tough for the points with 3 wounds, storm shields, and access to transhuman like the rest of these Primaris infantry. Maybe particularly relevant on them though, being an incredibly tough squad with only toughness 4. For the points they kick out some very good melee damage, 4 attacks each or 5 for the sergeant, all at strength 5, AP -3 and damage 2 is usually going to worry just about anything that they contact. I'd say perhaps their biggest issue is anything that's got a damage -1 rule on it, things like Orc Ramshackle or Death Guard. Admittedly, they will be a fair bit more underwhelming against them, but still have a decent volume of attacks. Otherwise, for the durability, it does come at the price of them being fairly slow. Vanguard veterans with jump packs and storm shields certainly give them some very stiff competition. The big 12-inch threat range and flight is very nice to have. Overall though, they're a really general purpose unit. I think a cheap unit or two could be an easy include in a lot of chapters. Black Templars will like them with all the character buffs that they can get, plus their Relic Bearers rule can make one of them very tanky. Blood Angels +1 to wound is excellent with strength 5 weapons. White Scars give them a far bigger charge threat range and potentially damage 3 weapons when they charge. That really helps counteract the -1 damage thing. For Dark Angels, they count as Deathwing, so are always going to be wounded on just a 4+. Plus they can be taken in the unique Deathwing detachment, which is very nice. Space Wolves also have all sorts of melee buffs that they can layer. They can use stratagems for early assault doctrine or +1 to wound, so can be some of the most dangerous Blade Guard around. And I think Salamanders are worth a mention as well. I think that Blade Guard are one of the best units for using that self-sacrifice stratagem on. Potentially you could have a big unit of these slogging up the board, and then tanking damage for a more fragile damage dealer unit behind. Maybe screening for a scary unit of aggressors or eradicators perhaps. Overall very solid elites, a unit to fear for many I think, and a good one just to throw into the midfield. Next up we have some of the premier anti-tank in the Space Marine Codex in the Eradicators. I've chosen to rank them third, as they basically do their given role better than just about any other rival. I believe that they have the biggest potential for anti-tank damage in the Codex if you can deliver them to where they need to be. They've got very solid damage at 24-inch range, if they get within 12 inches they get a +2 on all of their rolls, and for taking out enemy heavies they're just about as good as it gets at range, particularly on infantry. Strategic reserves can be a nice one to include on a small unit of 3 of them, gives you an outflanking threat that the opponent's going to struggle to just ignore, and you can potentially get some very crazy damage outputs on the go with things like multi-melters or heavy melter rifles. Both of those add yet more threat for a very cheap cost. While being really good at their given role though, it does mean that they're a little bit monodimensional. They're not going to help you out against hordes, they're relatively slow moving and limited range, so delivery can be an issue, and their durability is kind of so-so, though hopefully the idea is that they get the alpha strike on the opponent and make back their points before they even get to be shot. Competition-wise, they're going to face competition from things like the Redemptor Dreadnought or Attack Bikes, who pack multi-melters and move very fast. And if you want their actual decent damage output, they do all have to focus down one target, they can't split fire. Though I don't really think that this is much of an issue in practice if you are taking small squads of 3. I think that in general, if you want some anti-tank, Eradicators are basically good in literally any chapter. Maybe some particular standouts are Salamanders for +1 to wound with their melters. The single wound reroll is also pretty handy. And again, for ignoring penalties to move and shoot, both Ultramarines and Iron Hands are really nice with the heavy melter rifles or the multi-melter. Very accurate damage on the move. For just about any chapter though, a cheap squad of 3 of these in strategic reserve for 1 CP is generally going to give you a threat that the enemy is going to have to screen or worry about, and should hopefully deal some hefty damage before they get taken out. Next up, in second place, I've chosen to rank the Primaris battle line, the standard Space Marine Intercessors. Still a unit that I think is really hard to go too far wrong with. A solid durable troops choice that fills the slots that you need to unlock the command points. I feel like the vast majority of lists are going to profit for at least 1 or 2 units of these. They maybe feel a bit more necessary than some. There's loads of different ways that you could deal damage, but objectives are usually going to be necessary, and I think that these are some of the best for that role. Typically, I tend to take the Autobolt Carbine for some fairly efficient light infantry killing, typically holding down home field objectives and doing actions and things, but they can always advance into the midfield or do a counter charge if it makes sense. They can bully enemy light infantry really quite well in multiple phases. The 2 command point option to rapid fire can be situationally really useful as well. If it's going to make the difference between killing one more last crucial light infantry and them taking an objective, then having that in the back pocket for just a few more crucial bolt shots is always kind of useful. Typically I think they're a little bit stronger than the assault intercessors, maybe a bit less positioning dependent. They really can focus on doing the objectives while laying down some bolt shots, and can still make some reasonable account of themselves in melee, particularly when you get to the assault doctrine. Obviously it's a bit of a trade-off though, melee chapters will get a bit more advantage out of the assault intercessors, as they're going to make them even scarier. As a troops choice, their damage output is okay for troops I think, but obviously nowhere near as good as most of the elites, meaning in general you might want some intercessors but not loads, and being general purpose faction troops, just about any chapter can make decent use of them. Ultramarines get on really well with their standard bolt rifles, rapid firing out to 30-inch range. White Scars love the auto bolt rifles, moving, advancing, shooting, and then maybe even charging after that for a really threatening troops choice. And again, Imperial Fists will love mass bolter fire. Kind of hard to go too far wrong with a bit of extra damage output. Even the assault chapters though will get decent value out of multiple attacks, and you can make a bit of a cheap mixed threat unit, adding something like a power fist or a power sword to the sergeant. Finally, and my choice for first place in the Primaris infantry comparison, I've decided to go for infiltrators and incursors, who I still think, for the investment that you get and dominating the midfield early, are one of the best choices for winning the overall game in the Space Marine army list. In general, I think it's almost never going to be a bad choice to have 1 or 2 units of these, and you can choose which one you prefer for your own army's role. Incursors are just 1 point more than intercessors, infiltrators are 24 points, and they basically do all the things that intercessors do, being durable troops choices, bully some light infantry, do actions well, and get obsec and can use transhuman physiology. Their main disadvantage is that they do lose out on a bit of damage output compared with the intercessors, but they're basically trading that for more utility. Obviously the main draw to these guys is being able to forward deploy. You can set them up on midfield objectives, have them all ready to objective secure them for as soon as you can score them, do actions early like retrieving data and banners, get in table quarters for engage on all fronts, and even go for first turn charges if it makes sense against the right targets, annoying the enemy by killing or locking up their units in their own deployment zone before they've even had the chance to have a first turn. Out of the 2 units, I think both of them are very usable. For infiltrators, you're basically paying the premium on them for those Omni Scramblers, 12-inch worth of deep strike denial. It does feel a little bit painful to pay the points premium, but against some armies it can be absolutely key. You're really going to be screwing with some armies and how they want to take objectives. Things like Genestealer Cult are just not going to be able to touch these from reserve, and it can even make infiltrators a really powerful choice for holding down your backfield objective, plonk them down there, and you know that the opponent's not going to be able to deep strike charge them. A really nice rule, and can really punish armies that are going to be wanting to make heavy use of reserve. Incursors on the other hand don't get that big advantage, but they're very cheap to make up for it, only 1 point more than intercessors, a great deal for that forward deployment. They might not do quite as much range damage, but they make up for it with a bit more AP in melee, allowing them to bully light infantry even better. For cheap units that are going to do a bit of screening, trading and dying, they're really nice. They often can be just that unit that your opponent can't really afford to move to deal with, lying low in cover on an outfield objective, quietly winning the game, and putting up some fair resistance against light infantry if the enemy does try and take it off them. If they want a bit of extra survivability, they can even use smoke bombs, which is really quite a powerful defensive buff against anything that hits on 4s. Their main weakness is that they really don't do all that much damage. They're only really going to be a threat for light infantry for the points, but to be honest that isn't really their role. These guys are helping you win the game as a whole, and hopefully letting your damage dealers do what they do well. In terms of particularly strong chapters for them, I think Ultramarines work excellently with the Phobos troops. Their rapid redeployment can allow you to perfectly react to the opponent's setup, put them up really aggressively on objectives to get to work early. If it looks like they're just going to get killed for no return, you can pull them back as far as you need to, and still have them in a very annoying forward position, ready to counterattack. Melee chapters and incursors work really well. They can be surprisingly fighty and really put the pain on light infantry there. And basically anything that makes them really hard to shift is a really nice bonus. Black Templars and their 5+ invul saves can help, or Iron Hands for a 6+ feel no pain. That can be really nice on outlying units, ones whose main job is just to survive on the objectives, and if they do that then they're helping to win you the mission. I think it's the mission thing that really makes me want to rank them first. I just feel that there's very rarely going to be any Space Marine list that isn't going to profit a bit from holding the midfield with one of the units of these, whereas with most lists you've got the option of doing lots of different things for damage dealing, so maybe any one damage dealer just feels a little bit less standout. So I think that just about brings us to the end of the video. So here's my overall list of ranking the various different Primaris infantry units. Obviously it's just one opinion, so I look forward to hearing any other alternate takes down in the comments. I do feel that other people could come up with some very different lists to me. It depends on what you value on objectives versus damage output, and of course your chapter choice and playstyle. both of which are going to make you value certain units far more than others. Anyway, I look forward to hearing which ones work best for you. Always interesting to hear some different takes on marine tactics. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep these regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines over the year. And finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, then the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.